We have individuals who've gone back and gotten their PhD.
Our speaker this morning is Dr. Brian Davis. He, as you can see on the screen, is the Associate Executive Director for Professional Learning with the Michigan Association of Superintendents and Administrators. And in chatting with Brian just recently, he cites that his main goals are to work with superintendents in developing them, as well as beginning administrators. And I asked Brian to put this on the screen because you can see that he's been a loyal Michigan student all his life. His BA is from Central, his MA from Eastern, and his doctorate is from Western. And you can also see the progression of his career, starting out as an elementary principal. I met Brian when he was a middle school counselor, and then we brought him to Holland Public as an elementary principal. And from there, he became assistant superintendent for teaching and learning, and lastly, provided 13 years of service as a superintendent. He retired from Holland Public just last year, and now has moved on to the Michigan Association. Brian is known for his love of research, and you'll see that in the presentation this morning. He is willing to experiment because his heart is with kids, and he always strives to help them become better learners. And so in that process, he becomes very responsive in action. And as you look at Holland Public over the last 13 years and the amount of change and innovation that he's brought to the district, you would appreciate his skill level. And I assume that many of you who are attending this morning are teachers or have been teachers. And so you know the value of quality educators in the classroom. And Brian will be presenting this morning on this pandemic because we do face a shortage of teachers. And so without further ado, I give you Brian, Dr. Davis, excuse me.
Well, thank you, Dr. Dahlman. Jan.
You're welcome.
Jan and I had the pleasure, as she mentioned, knowing each other now for, gosh, 22 years now. 23 years going on when I first started in Holland back in 2000, and has been a great professional colleague, friend, mentor, thought partner. We've had an opportunity to serve on different boards together and just really continue to impact the community. And it's a pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate the invitation from HASP and from Jane to do this. It's not my first time doing a HASP presentation. I recognize some names and faces who have sat through some of my presentations before, and I'm hopeful that we have just a lovely conversation this morning around a difficult topic. And so I do, in good teacher form, have some learning targets that I'd like to accomplish with us today. I'd like to share with you the context. Just what are we up against? What is happening? We have had a teacher shortage in Michigan now growing for the past decade. We certainly have had cycles of teacher shortages throughout our history in Michigan and across our country. And it's been cycling to when we had a surplus, when you might have 300 applicants for one third grade position at an elementary school, to today where school districts can post a job and have 0 applicants. So what are we up against, and how this has been further exacerbated by another pandemic, a global health pandemic, and that being COVID-19. Given that, I'd like to share with you some of the contributing factors that are contributing to this changing landscape and what the impact then is on the profession. And there's 2 impacts that I'll hit on today. One specifically is the talent pipeline. When we think about a talent pipeline in schools, as Jan shared a little bit of my progression, oftentimes a teacher in the classroom who wants to do and have greater systemic impact decides to become an administrator. So that teacher might become an instructional coach, they might become a counselor, and then they transition into some level of building level leadership. It could be department chairs, it could even be an assistant principal or moving into the principalship itself. Individuals then, that becomes a pipeline for the central office staff positions, for people to move into human resources or school finance or curriculum and development. And that becomes a pipeline for the superintendent position. So this shortage in teachers, in essence, is creating a shortage for principals and a shortage for superintendents. I'll share some of that data a little bit later. And as we talk about grow your own programs, which is a new method of trying to address this issue across our schools, paraprofessionals, instructional assistants, bus drivers, food service workers, secretaries, anyone who we identify as having a love for children, who's willing to go back and get education to become a teacher. We're tapping those individuals, but unfortunately, those positions are all at a deficit right now also. Just watching the landscape continue here in Holland, I drive by schools and I see the school buses posted and parked in parking lots and throughout the community. Bus drivers needed. Districts across the state have had to cancel school days because they didn't have enough drivers to transport kids. So this pipeline is a shortage across the education sector. With a shortage of teachers becomes a significant impact on student achievement. And unfortunately, this manifests itself more frequently in small rural districts. I have colleagues now in the Upper Peninsula whose districts are 700 square miles. And it's difficult for them to find and retain quality teachers who are also certified in their content areas, especially math or science, and the growing need for our special education population. This is also true in our urban school districts. Holland would be an example of an urban school district. The ability to recruit and retain teachers in our urban schools where our most disenfranchised and marginalized students historically attend. And in those centers, the small and rural districts and the urban school districts, compensation and overall benefit levels typically are less than your more affluent suburban area districts. Unfortunately, what's happening now is significant poaching, recruiting individuals not from colleges and universities, but from neighboring school districts to work. So we've gotten into a compensation war that's always existed, but it's much more prevalent now. So given all of those pieces, I want to talk a little bit about, so what can we do, perhaps short-term and long-term, and then spend a little bit of time, what do teachers really say they want to have to continue and stay in the profession? And certainly compensation and benefit levels are important factors, but there's so much more behind that about what teachers say they really need to be supported. So that's our learning targets that I'd like to make sure that we talk about today. So given that, I'd like to share a little bit about where we're headed. And Hanover Research is an entity that we work with the MASA to help us understand best practices across the country. And what they do from a research perspective is they do meta-analysis of case studies, quantitative and qualitative research studies. They look at practices across thriving and successful school districts, and they bring all that information together, and they publish briefs a couple times a week on a variety of different topics. If you're interested in Hanover Research, you could certainly sign up and become a member and get those briefs. And you're able to search an extensive research library about the various topics. I'd like to share their most recent one, and it's reflecting on what they believe are the top 5 trends that will shape K-12 education in 2022. So their information is current and relevant and doesn't project out too far. So it keeps it in front of us in terms of our present. But trend number 1, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives face risk of derailment. We certainly see that with all the conversation around critical race theory, what that is and what that is not. Today, the Michigan Department of Education released their stance and upcoming webinars that you could sign up for free if you go to their website about teaching the true history of the United States. And it's important that our students understand and recognize what has been left out of the understanding of our country. And the first 2 webinars are on the Holocaust and on our indigenous peoples of Michigan. So across the state at many, many board tables, the conversation of the D word, if you mention the D word, diversity, brings out in this political and cultural landscape many different opinions and ideas around what we should or should not be teaching on this topic. And the understanding of critical race theory as a post-secondary theory and not a K-12 curriculum. That would be another HASS presentation. Trend 2. Districts confront record high teacher turnover. So how do we strengthen and support our teacher and administrator well-being? to counter this complex staffing shortage. And the staffing shortage impacts those that are currently in the system. So if a second grade teacher is no longer there and I'm the only other second grade teacher and we can't find a qualified sub, what does that look like for me as the only second grade teacher on a day-to-day basis? Or how am I assisting and helping a substitute teacher colleague? Or how am I helping to develop a new teacher in that position, et cetera, et cetera. Trend number 3, students will continue to struggle with trauma and learning loss. We have always had inequities across the K-12 sector pre-COVID, but many of those were brought to the surface and shared, and more people became aware about what some of those inequities were. But we know during this pandemic, even as adults, the way it impacted our social relationships, our day-to-day living, our accesses to resources, the things that made us healthy and joyful, that's exacerbated the trauma in our schools, not just with our students, but the secondary trauma that many of our educators are facing by holding all of this trauma of their kids and families together. So how do we continue to provide those supports for our teachers specifically as they work day in and day out with families and navigate through that to ensure that we're able to keep them in the profession? Trend number 4, kind of mentioned this, politically charged atmospheres create challenges for district leaders. We're narrowing in now on 90 new superintendents in the state of Michigan this year. 90. That's a record high. We see superintendents leaving the profession in droves. Almost 2 a week now are either resigning from their position, retiring from their position, or have been fired from their position. All based on the first 3 trends I just talked about. So the conversations at the board table have never been more polarized within communities than what I've seen in my 30 years in education. So how do superintendents and school boards continue to work together to build consensus and relationships within their communities as we're grappling with some very challenging topics? And then trend number 5 is that short-term funding requires complex collaborative decision-making. We are historically in a space and place where schools have never received the infusion of federal dollars and even state dollars in what we are receiving today. But with all of that money comes increased accountability and responsibility to say, what is it that we can do that's going to have the greatest impact, not only on teacher development, principal development, improvement of instructional practice, resulting in enhanced and improved student achievement, but to be able to look at best practices and research that we can have short and long-term impact, and then be able to maintain when these federal dollars are no longer here. So when you hear about districts saying, oh, we're going to address mental health support and we're going to hire elementary school counselors in all of our buildings, that's great. But the elementary school counselors don't exist to do that, number 1. But number 2, what are you going to do in 3 years when that money is no longer there? So how do we grapple with those pieces? So what does that all mean? This. For the past year and a half or so, this has been the debate, the public comment at school board meetings across the country. Do we wear masks or do we not wear masks? Values and belief systems have been challenged around science of health, the common good, all related to this global pandemic related to COVID. A lot of discussion around critical race theory. Not a topic for today, but please do not sign the petition that's coming around that's initiated by Betsy DeVos to funnel away monies from our K-12 sector in this new voucher choice scholarship that's being turned. And of course, the whole impact around how do we educate kids in this virtual learning environment. There are school districts that will have board meetings that go until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning now, because there are so many individuals there providing public comment around these topics. And what does this mean? So that's the context of our conversation today. I can only see 4 people on my screen. I hope I didn't lose anybody in that context of discussion. And I don't mean to depress anybody, because this is a real opportunity for us to make a significant difference in what we're going to do. So I want you to, this next slide, to just take a look and think about. When you see this advertisement that came out last week, what wonderings, emotions, or questions does it surface? This is a real advertisement from Jackson Public Schools. Jackson is south of Lansing, about 40 minutes. I grew up near Jackson on a small rural farm. Calling all teachers, Jackson Public Schools wants you a $10,000 sign-on bonus. Okay, $10,000 is almost 1/3 of a beginning teacher's salary. So a $10,000 sign-on bonus, and they will student loan forgive all of your student loan debt. The average teacher now leaves the post-secondary sector with $30,000 in loans. Many much more than that, but the average is 30. So they're going to pay off your student loan as long as you fulfill your contract. Jan, when you see this sign, and this is the second time you've seen the ad because you had a chance to preview. When you saw that, when you hear me explain that, you just unmute yourself. What does that, what questions, wonderings, what does that mean for you as you think about this landscape? How dire is this crisis?
Well, if I were in a school district, I, number one, couldn't compete with this. Number two, I wouldn't do this because this draws people that may or may not be quality teachers. I'd have a lot of questions.
Very true. Are these going to be brand new teachers coming in? Are they going to be senior teachers? Hopefully they will have a great hiring process that they would ensure that they're hiring the best quality candidates to come in. But now that creates for that neighboring district, as you point out, if I'm not offering this, I'm not going to get the same kind of candidates perhaps, or I might lose some of my teachers from my district now to move into Jackson to do this. My reason in sharing this ad, and perhaps some of you have some other thoughts, and if you want to pop those into the chat feature, we can certainly highlight some of those, is it kind of shows a desperation. It shows a desperation that we're trying to do everything that we can to do this. And it also creates this, an expectation to move forward. You know, I'm going to say this tongue in cheek, but pre-COVID, I went through the McDonald's drive line, and it's no offense to our individuals working to make a living working at McDonald's, and they would take your order, and that's $9.75. Would you like fries with that? Whatever the case might be, you pull around and you pay. And you were making minimum wage to do that. McDonald's is now paying almost $18 an hour for that same person to do that same thing because of the shortage of employees. Will teachers now, will individuals moving forward with a new generation expect that there's always going to be this loan forgiveness and sign-on bonus? This, while I understand the need to hire individuals and they have the federal funds to do that, this is an unsustainable practice. And we may create now a new false expectation of what it's going to mean to be hired into a school system. So it just creates all kinds of dynamics. A substitute teacher used to make $95 or $90 a day in most school districts in our area, $110 if you've been there for a long time. Not really enough given the work that substitute teachers do. There are districts now paying $400 a day to sub. In some cases, that's more than what the teacher who's brand new is making per day in the classroom next to them, because there's such a dire need for this. So when we think from a business model perspective, we also have to be conscious of that. I found this graphic as I was putting this together, and I thought, oh my gosh, you know, you have two kids walking along the sidewalk on their way to school, and here's this missing sign. There's a reward of $36,000. Have you seen my teacher? It just kind of exacerbates this national trend that's occurring in our teaching workforce. And there's all kinds of data around this, and Hanover has tried to sift through a lot of it. But basically what the Learning Policy Institute has estimated that the shortage began in 2012, 2013. We're in it now still, and they're saying it's going to worsen through 2024, 25. So we have another 3 to 4 years of this, and that this is going to really increase with severity when considering teachers' credentials and qualifications, especially in some of those hard to fill areas, sciences, math, they've historically been there, special education. You'll see now a lot of school districts having to grapple with how do we provide some of our quality arts programs, music, theater, orchestra, how do we do industrial arts, even the shortage in elementary teaching positions. So all of these things become a contributing factor in how this is going to continue to be a problem as we move forward. So with that, I want to share some trends And I want to share with you some explanations as to why this might be occurring. This comes from the University of Pennsylvania Graduate School of Education and Insight Education Group. And these are our two pieces that were highlighted in the Hanover research. So first of all, I'm looking at the left side, the current workforce trends. There's been a leap in numbers. So between 87 and 88, when I graduated from high school and went into then my bachelor's degree program to become a teacher, and then in 15, 16, the number of teachers in the public and private sector, and also inclusive of charter schools, they increased more than 3 times the rate of what student enrollment was. There's those 2 times in the past 30 years where we've had that happen. That's the only 2 times, okay? But given that, then and now, 44% of new teachers leave within the first 5 years. 44%. That is an alarming number and statistic. And I'll share some reasons as to why that is a little bit later, but basically in summary, it's related to preparation. Did my post-secondary institution prepare me well to work in the climate environment which I've taken a position? What kind of staff development and support in terms of mentoring and coaching is provided to me when I take that job? There's compensation pieces. I thought I wanted to be a teacher. I have a math and science degree, and I just realized I can make 4 times that in a job outside of the public sector and move in the private sector. All kinds of issues related to that. We have a much younger teaching force now. In 2007-8, the modal or most common teacher age was 55 years old. Today, it's the mid-30s to mid-40s. We could have a whole nother HAS presentation on the generational differences in terms of how individuals approach work, how many hours they're willing to work, what they're willing to work for, how loyal they are to an organization to stay over time. We see a lot of trends in mobility, wanting to work virtually from home as I am today versus having to report to an office. All of those kinds of generational differences are impacting our teaching workforce. And of course, as we'll see a little bit later, the baby boomers, the last of the baby boomers are retiring out of the system. And they have a very different generational impact of how they were raised and how they approached work than our current millennials and Gen Zs. I think the Gen Ys, and there's a new one I don't even know the letter for yet. There's a decline in experience, which is a direct correlation now to student achievement. The model teacher has 1 to 3 years of experience. 1 to 3 years of experience compared to 15 years in 1987-98. So we have, with a younger teacher force, we're going to have a younger work experience. About 70% of the superintendents in the state of Michigan right now have 3 years or less experience. 70%. That's not to make a judgment statement. It's just the reality of, and professional experience, lived experience, all contribute to our toolbox and resources that we have to address some of these complex problems that we're facing. Over 76% of public school teachers are women, high even for a historically female-dominated profession. In Michigan, it's closer to 85%. Minorities that are being recruited and developed to teach in our school districts are finding a difficult time to retain and stay in those districts. So there's a gap. While there remains a parity gap, 51% of public school students are minorities, only about 20% of their teachers are. So how do I see mirrors and windows? If I'm an African-American or Black student or a Hispanic student, how do I see myself reflected in the curriculum? How do I see myself reflected in other professionals within the school district? And if I'm part of the white dominant population, how do I see windows where I can understand students from different backgrounds and communities and cultures through my curriculum, through my teachers? So it's a both and, windows and mirrors to prepare our students for that global world. So when we have still a curriculum and a teaching force that is still predominantly white and reflects the majority population and majority population ideals, that's why that teaching of the history of our country and those true history pieces are so critically important. And then the instability is concentrated. About half of the teacher turnover takes place in 25% of public schools. Think about that. The 44% that are leaving, about half of that happens in 25% of our schools. And that's our highest poverty, high minority, urban, and rural public schools. One of the greatest challenges I faced in Holland, we could recruit the most amazing teachers. We would skill them up and provide them amazing support and staff development. The teaching staff in Holland Public, just phenomenal. And the mentoring and supports they provide to one another. And then they would leave because they would be able to make more money in another location. And because they were recognized as what they were able to do, they were a highly sought after teacher candidate. So Holland had that challenge of ongoing hiring, training, hiring, training, hiring, training. And there's a cost to do that. There's an economic cost, there's a time cost, there's a student achievement cost. So why might some of these teacher shortages be occurring? According to the research across the country, women today have greater options in employment than ever before. So a profession that was largely dominated by women, now women have greater opportunities, even though we still have a pay gap, a gender pay gap that's not expected to close now for another 99 years, as we're coming off Women's History Month. The data has now been moved out. There's still another topic in another day, but women have greater opportunities. There's more occupational choice in general. The perception of teaching by the American public and teachers themselves is declining. We had a slight uptick last year when parents were like, oh my God, get my kids out of the house, get them away from the dining room table. I can't handle 5 virtual classrooms happening all at the same time. And oh, we have to Zoom this and meet that, plan this and oh my gosh, I can't say enough about my teacher. I love you, I love you, I love you. That was short-lived. It's now gone again. Not gone completely. There's still a appreciation, but it's declining again and dwindling. The pipeline of new teacher candidates, I'll share some more information, is declining. And the way that job seekers look for jobs has radically changed, including an increased focus on digital communication and marketing efforts. So all of these things are impacting this landscape. So with that, what's happening? Since 2009 to 2019, and unfortunately these trend lines are continuing, we just don't have the data out yet, you can see that the K-12 enrollment has declined by about 10% across our state. When I started in my superintendency, we had about 1.7 million students in the K-12 sector. We're down under 1.3 million today. So we have that continued decline. But look at the teacher prep enrollment and completers. Over this 10-year period of time, teacher prep in just the state of Michigan has declined by 56%. And the individuals who start a teacher preparation program and actually complete has declined by 60%, nearly 60%. There are colleges and universities in the state of Michigan who had teacher preparation programs 5 years ago that no longer do. They've shuttered and closed the doors. So we have a shortage of people wanting to go into the profession. We have fewer colleges and universities that actually have teacher preparation programs. So to be able to solve this is going to require a multifaceted approach to be able to say, how do we continue to provide enough teachers to do this? Regardless of where you stand on the charter school issue, we've also increased the number of school districts and schools in the state despite this decline in enrollment. And so whenever you open more charter schools and more buildings with the same number of kids in the state, that reduces the number of kids in buildings across the state, but requires more employees. Do you follow what I'm saying here? So we've created a real challenge to be able to say, how do we address this? We don't need more schools. Perhaps we need fewer quality schools. And we certainly need higher quality and more numbers of teachers and teacher prep institutions. I believe, I don't know if Kim can speak to this or not. I know her daughter is enrolled in the teacher prep program at Hope. I think Hope is actually one of the few universities that has experienced an uptick, and Grand Valley State University has experienced an uptick as well. So there's some good things that are happening here locally, but across the state, we still have a major issue. Now, here's what our legislators will say. We don't have a problem. Because in the state of Michigan, there's 185,000 people who have their teaching certificate, and only 86,000 are currently employed. So we don't have a teacher shortage. Well, I'm here to tell you, those 185,000 people include people like myself. I have my teaching certificate. There may be individuals on the screen who still have an active teaching certificate or not, but you may be retired. You may have left the profession to raise a family. You may have left the profession to take on a different career. You may not be medically able to do that. So just because we say we have 185,000 with certificates, oh, guess what? Many of those people are also building level principals. They're literacy coaches. They're Title I assistants. They're counselors. They're superintendents. So we have to really unpack that information and say, yeah, but what's the story behind the story? 68% of those with teaching certificates are under 65 and still living in Michigan. We've got a workforce that can work, the legislators will say. The reality is teacher retirements in Michigan are up 44% compared to the same time frame of 2019-20. So if you think about a school years always juggle two calendar years. So in 2019-20, when the pandemic hit, to compare to 2021, teacher retirements are up 44%. That's significant. 749 of those individuals retired mid-year. When a teacher retires mid-year, it creates an increased challenge on that school district, on that building, and on that classroom, especially in some of our younger grade classrooms. No one's fault to this. I'm just trying to share with you what's happening. There are over 18,600 teachers eligible for retirement this year. If you do some simple math, that's almost 25% of our current teachers in the system of 86,000. So if about 25% of our teachers retire this year, there is no way we're going to be able to fill those positions because there aren't the candidates there to fill it with. And an additional just under 12,000 teachers in our system today, and this is just Michigan, have 20 to 25 years of service. So we are very senior staff, a very educated staff who are making incredible differences in our classroom. Their toolbox is rich and full of addressing all the challenges that schools face today. And these men and women are working incredibly hard, but they're deciding and trying to decide how much longer can I move through the current situation that we have in schools and the impact that COVID has had. And so if you were eligible and bought 5 years of retirement credit through the Michigan pension system, those that have 25 years could now retire. Both of my sisters bought those 5 years. They're considering whether or not they retire. They're 48 years old. If they retire, that creates another burden on the pension system because now fewer people are paying into that pension system. And with all the kinds of services that have been privatized, that's impacted the system. And so one of the things that no longer exists is you can't buy 5 years anymore. That was taken out so people can't retire early, but that's another piece. So if we have 18,000 that are eligible and another that could, and 12,000 that might be, we're getting close to 40% of our teaching force in the state. So this further creates more destabilization in our schools. It costs taxpayers dollars because you're having to spend a lot of money of recruiting and hiring and training and recruiting and hiring and training and substitutes and recruiting. It just creates a never-ending cycle. And who does it hurt most? It hurts most our kids. And it mostly hurts our most vulnerable kids. Jan, I don't know if we have any questions or thoughts in the chat, or Kim, that this might be a natural pausing point of reflection or thoughts. And Jan, maybe you can add some of your own thoughts. I know you are a very reflective person too, and to add to this conversation, just what might be going through our minds right now. What questions does this raise? Anybody?
How do we stop the bleeding? How do we, I mean, I know that classrooms now are microcosms of the tensions and the divisiveness and the hurt that's present in our state. And so teachers are facing more responsibility for mental wellness. They're in addition to maintaining the curriculum and verifying that students are achieving. And so I guess my wondering is, given that, And given, I mean, you can talk with teachers and they say, man, I don't know how much longer I can do this, because they're feeling burnout. So how do we as a society come around, both teachers and the system, to say, we believe in you. We know that public education is the rock on which our citizenry is built. And if we don't have an educated society, then we're open to all other kinds of issues. So it's a huge question, and I don't have answers, but I certainly have questions.
Yeah, I appreciate those thoughts, Jan, and I would agree 100%. The data that I'm sharing with you today could be Wisconsin, could be Oklahoma, could be Virginia. This is what's happening across our country. So the core foundation of our democracy is at risk here, in terms of who we are, as Jan mentioned, that is a citizenry, in how do we lift the education profession. And there are so many things that we can do to lift the education profession that don't cost us any money. Notes of appreciation to our teachers. If you know a teacher, just thanking them for what they do, lending a listening ear, making sure that they're taking care of themselves and their well-being. Because this post-secondary trauma or secondary trauma that many of our educators are facing is real. And I see it manifest itself in so many different ways, not just our teachers, but in the sector that I work with, school superintendents. And so what can we do to do that? So you may begin to hear about, if you haven't already, Launch Michigan. Launch Michigan is working to establish the great or grand bargain. It's an unprecedented partnership where business leaders have come together. The leaders of education and all of our state associations in Michigan have come together. The MEA and the AFT, representing the labor groups of our teaching, have come together. Philanthropy has come together. Civic leaders have come together, as well as parents, who all care deeply about education in our state and our collective future. And they're beginning to address many of these issues. And I'm going to be co-chairing one of these committees that Launch has identified in terms of this grand bargain about how do we significantly change the education landscape in Michigan from a performance standpoint and what student outcomes and achievements will be, but also in terms of how do we grow this workforce back and how do we provide the supports that are necessary for teachers? Because they recognize as business leaders, if we have a talent crisis and if we have an education crisis, that's going to bleed over into every other sector in terms of employability and skills to hire into our businesses, into our civic positions, into our professional practices. So they recognize that as educators are aging out and retiring early or leaving the education profession altogether for better paying or more attractive jobs, or simply having been pushed over the edge, we need to do something substantially different. And we need to look at enrollment in the number of education institutions that we have in our state. They recognize that this is impacting our most vulnerable students, and we have more vulnerable students in the state of Michigan than we've ever had before. And they're 3 times more likely to not have a permanent teacher in the classroom. Muskegon Heights, just up the road from us, school district, urban school district, followed kids through their elementary years and how many teachers that they had from kindergarten through 5th grade. The kids didn't have the same teacher kindergarten through 5th grade in the same year. In one case, in 3rd grade, the one girl had 5 different 3rd grade teachers in that one year. So when you have that kind of churn and change occurring in some of our schools, it's going to impact those outcomes. These kids have 3 times more likely to not have a permanent teacher in the classroom for that year. Our state can't find enough people to even stand in front of the children in our classrooms. This is a pandemic of just astronomical proportion.
Barb Kidd had a question.
Yes.
About pre-professionals. Can we create a program, a pre-professional program for aids, instructional aids. Is that correct, Barb? Am I citing you correctly?
These are
Yes.
called, go ahead,
Yes.
Barb.
I was not a teacher, although I was one of those folks with a teaching certificate. I became a public librarian, but there were programs in the 60s, you know, ancient history, I know, where in the first place, your student teaching lasted a whole semester, not 8 weeks, so that when you got your degree, you had some degree of real experience. And in librarianship, those of us who already had a degree, and I'm wondering now if it might be applied to those folks that we're putting in the classroom as substitutes, as bodies to stand in front of these kids, if we couldn't establish a program whereby either the district or the state somehow keeps that person in the classroom, but also in school to continue to reach at least a bachelor's degree rather than 60 hours. So
Yeah.
that they have, and that it counts as, and their time in class counts as their student teaching while they are making a salary, which often was a downer for those folks who couldn't count their instructional time in the classroom as a pay. They had to leave their jobs or couldn't be paid for the 2 or 3 months that they now spend as a student teacher.
Yeah, Barb, you raised some great points with that. They're being called now grow your own programs, but student teaching now in some sectors and universities is an entire year, especially in the special education sector. So there's a good and a bad with that, right? The good is you're getting phenomenal experience to then take over your own classroom and learning from master teachers. The bad is it takes much longer to get them in front of a classroom. When we look at substitute teachers, it used to be 60 college credits. Now is if you're a school secretary and employee of the district, you can now be a sub in that classroom. Well, that's good in the fact that now you're able to do school and you have someone in front of them. But the reverse could also be how prepared is that individual to deliver now a more complex curriculum than we've ever had before. We won't even talk about the read by grade 3 bill that exists. So we need to look at all these pieces. How do we provide incentives? How do we not require college students to have to pay for student teaching? You're paying to do your work and you're not getting any pay with that. So we need to look at all those pieces and identifying talent within the system right away. We need to look at early college high school programs. One of the things that Holland has is an early college high school. And when I left the district, we were beginning to have conversations about how do we create a teacher preparation program? How do we identify students during their junior or senior year that might be interested in teaching, get that first 2 years of education done, paid for, and then be able to transition into their continued years of study. So all of these things need to be reviewed and looked at, and Launch Michigan is doing just that. Jen, I see we have a person with their hand raised as well on the iPad.
Go ahead, Donna.
Hello, this is Donna Bogle. Well, I really have worried about this class coming up. You know, it's just been on my mind for 2 years, and I'm so glad Brian has been here because he's been an innovative superintendent for the Holland system. I have just a few thoughts, nothing that is going to solve the problem, but of course, salary is the main thing. I understand that beginning teachers can't even afford to live in Holland, even though they may be employed in the districts that are here locally. They have to drive long distance because the housing situation is just untenable for the kind of salaries that they are receiving. Plus now the gasoline prices will impact their small salary as well. So affordable housing and their salary needs to be considered at the same time. Class size has always worried me. When I was reading about successful states, the state of New Hampshire many, many years ago, capped all their elementary school class sizes at 18. And they had the best success in outcomes from their high school students by having small elementary school size classes. Now, how do you do that with fewer teachers? Perhaps you could look at the German or the European model where elementary school teachers have the same class for 3 years, but only for half a day. That's just an idea that seemed to have been working in Europe for a very long time. They teach in the mornings. The children do all of their work at home under the supervision of an older sibling or a parent or a babysitter, but they get all their instruction and information about how to read, do math and science from their teachers in the morning. Class size in Europe is not small, but I really appreciate a smaller class size for any child I know, because then I know they get more than a minute and a half of teacher attention on a personal level. How do we pay for these kind of things? I know that we're always giving large businesses tax incentives, and I'm assuming that means their taxes are lower or they don't pay a tax for quite a long time. But if they're intending to hire Americans who have inferior education in 12 years, then they might be concerned and they might like to be paying a school tax, just a school tax that goes to preparing new teachers and paying their salaries. I don't have an answer. It's making me very unhappy. Thanks, Brian.
Donna, thank you so much for lifting the intersectionality that exists here between the profession itself and the salary compensation, but the challenge and ability to live in these communities. Thank you for lifting that. And it's a real challenge here in Holland. The affordable housing piece has been a significant issue now for the past 5 to 7 years. The Alice study that was released, the number of folks that are working on that. It is true. Holland would hire teachers that would be driving in from St. Joe or Grand Rapids. And with the prices of gasoline now, what is the first thing you're going to do? As soon as a teaching job opens closer to my home, I'm going to go there. If you can't live in the school district, you're not going to be as engaged in the school district because you can't. You don't necessarily develop roots in that community and become a long-time community member. I had administrators in Holland who couldn't afford to live in Holland because they couldn't you'd have to buy a $180,000 home that required $60,000 to $80,000 worth of work to bring it up to where it needed to be, or it was a $300,000 or $400,000 home. And that just becomes unattainable for individuals just starting out. So thank you for lifting those intersections and for recognizing I'm a strong proponent too of those smaller class sizes, especially K3. I wanted to do that in Holland. 2 challenges. Now we need twice as many classrooms, so you don't have an infrastructure to support those smaller class sizes. And to the point you lifted, where do we get the teachers from to do that? So how do we look at teaching schedules? How do school buildings maybe operate on first and second shifts? There's all kinds of things to look at. That's what Launch Michigan is attempting to do. And for the first real time in our state, bringing all those sectors together to try to address that complex issue. They project in Michigan specifically, we need an additional 40,000 certified professional teachers. And I shared that with you from the number that are eligible to retire, right? Mm-hmm. And those that could retire in the next 5 years. We need 40,000 more teachers and at least 17,000 more professional instructional staff. So Kim, for your daughter, these numbers bode well, right? Who's going to be retiring, who's going to be graduating in a couple of years. And of that 40,000, now almost 60,000 new employees, we need to make sure that they're skilled up to work with our most vulnerable students to achieve these proficiency levels that have been identified. Because guess what? None of these state standards have been modified or adjusted substantially during this whole COVID epidemic. In fact, it's, how do we create more opportunities to learn? And how do we create more summer school? And how are we going to get all these kids caught up over the summer? I'm here to tell you, we're not going to get them caught up over the summer. This is a generational issue of loss. our second graders this year, for the first time, are in front of teachers that don't have masks in front of them. If you think about the developmental pieces that are so critical in those early years, and gestures and facial expressions and relationship building, our second graders are like for the first time experiencing school like you and I experienced school.
Right.
But I'm here to say probably school will never ever look the same again. So we're grappling with this. So what are all the contributing factors?
Brian, I have a
Yes.
few things that have come in chat that maybe we should, I should share with you now, or we're going to get overwhelmed at the end.
Sure.
The first thing is just a comment that from Jen. When I was in college in the late 70s and early 80s, there were programs to send education students to Australia and other countries. Have we looked at recruiting teachers from other countries again? It would also give some wonderful diversity to our students.
Oh, great point. I was one of those individuals. I studied in Australia and I did my student teaching in England. So
Wow.
great experiences. So yeah, that's a great point. I don't know what incentives there are to do that. I know some have been looking at bringing teachers from China specifically, and some of our Latin American countries to teach in our dual immersion and language schools. There's all kinds of policies issues around that, but yeah, great idea.
Okay, another comment is the standard that a college cannot offer a student credit for student teachers in class work if that time is paid. You can't be paid for college credit work, but that is a hindrance sometimes to the best plan. Still, I believe it is important not to allow a student being paid and also receive college credit. But if they are allowed travel allowances or food allowances per diem, that would offset the painful cost of student teaching time. That's an interesting thought.
It is. Launch Michigan, I'll share coming up in some of their strategies. Paying that student teaching practice and doing some of those things is part of their solution.
Okay, great. Another one, teacher retirement and healthcare insurance used to be very good. Both have been replaced in most districts by much less expensive and less quality programs. Could you comment on any of these factors?
Yes. So the pension system in Michigan, there's been multiple changes to that over time. Just so that you all know here, for every dollar that a K-12 school receives, 36 cents goes back to support the pension system.
Wow.
36 cents on the dollar. The pension system in the state of Michigan is very robust. I love it because I'm a beneficiary of that. Districts right now are paying about, depending upon their employee, between 28 cents and 32 cents on the dollar because the state is filling in that gap. But how long will our budget be able, the state budget able to do that? And as we have more people retiring from the system that are paying into the system, that creates a further pension challenge. Now, insurance escalated through the roof.
Yeah.
It's now $26,000 to $28,000 for full family coverage. Now we have to think about that. $28,000 on top of your salary is a pretty good total compensation package. Very few places in the private sector do you receive that kind of benefit unless you're at high levels of management. It is true that many systems have had to look at the cost of insurance and the shared cost of insurance. But when compared to other sectors, teachers and educators in general still have a very good system, and that continues into retirement. I have a better insurance now than what I had as a superintendent. And my teachers had a better insurance plan in Holland than I had as a superintendent. It was all good. I was taken care of, but in terms of cost and what you're paying. So we have a very robust system to help reward the profession, but it's unsustainable in its current format.
Here's another one. Is there an advocacy group or maybe a website that keeps us appraised of issues that we should be writing our politicians about?
Yes, you can go to this Launch Michigan website to do that. There's also a website, the Michigan School Finance Research Collaborative, who has done a study on how much schools need to have in terms of a basic foundation grant, and then a weighted formula to support schools, especially those that are serving a high rate of free reduced lunch students, special education, second language learners, etc. So the Launch Michigan website, you could go to the Michigan School Finance Research Collaborative, and there is also a website, if you search the new Betsy DeVos voucher system plan, there's a website that has just been started to provide the facts around what that piece is about. because our legislators will be voting on that if enough petitions are gathered. They only need, I think, 329,000 petitions across the state, or signed petitions, to be able to bring that forward. So those would be 3 different places that you could go to get some more specific information.
Okay, and then this one, I think you addressed the first part already. Isn't it true that more respect and generally better pay would help retain teachers? Obviously, I think so. Isn't
Absolutely.
it also true that we need a significantly different legislature? And following up on that was, how big a role did Michigan becoming a right to work state play in the current trend of teachers not staying in the profession? How about the loss of tenure now that teachers can be dismissed for no reason?
Well, first of all, teachers can't be dismissed for no reason. You still have to, it can't be arbitrary or capricious. It has to be, you need to have demonstrated evidence. There's still due process within that. With respect to, we have an education system legislatively where we have a governor, we have a House and a Senate, and then we have a state board of education who has a state superintendent. And none of them all work together in the same way, and they all have different powers and authority. And the State Board of Education has limited authority based upon what the legislature passes. And we have a state board elected, we have a state legislature elected with different term limits and cycles. And so we need to merely make sure that as we have individuals who are running for our office, that they understand this education landscape, and they understand the challenges, and they understand what's needed to improve our education system. There tends to be different ideals around what that looks like based upon political party. There's very big differences between the Republican and the Democratic Party. With respect to the right to work piece, when I left Holland, we never had better labor relations than what we had before. And that takes time, it takes sustainability in the leadership, it takes a lot of communication and building trust. And certainly with the right to work piece, certain subjects became prohibited subjects of bargaining. For example, professional staff evaluation and how you provide feedback to teachers wasn't something that you collectively bargained, but it didn't mean that you couldn't sit down with the leaders of your labor groups to talk about, so what might this look like and how can we do it together? You just couldn't write language of that nature into a contract. So there's, if individuals still embraced good practices of respect and humanity and collaboration and communication, and how do we approach this together so that we make sure that our teaching force, in this case, in our school district is best taken care of with the resources that are available. And then how do we partner outside of that? For example, one of the things that I did before I left Holland was trying to create a robust employee assistance program to address and deal with some of these stressors and get that paid for by an outside entity. Things that you have to begin to be creative around those pieces. I happen to be able to do some of those things because of the toolbox, because of some of the tools I had, because of some of the relationships I had established. As we have a newer workforce coming in, you don't always have some of those same relationships established yet. They come over time. So right to work did impact some things around some prohibited subject of bargainings. It did impact some pieces around what individuals could do or not do. Teachers had the choice of whether to be in the union or not, and whether or not to pay their union dues for different reasons. So there's a lot of things that became part of that, but it also created some opportunities to say, okay, we can't write it here, but it doesn't mean we can't still do the work over there. So I think I addressed all those 3 pieces, I hope, in that question.
I think so. The last one I have came in early, so if you address this, I apologize, but what are the population trends, or will you be talking about those in terms of new births, refugees, ingrowth, et cetera, from other locations that might affect the future of education? And
yeah, I can share with you that the birth trends are down in the state of Michigan. That was driven by some economics. Now it'll be interesting to see if birth rates climb with COVID, because people weren't able to go out and do other things. So they stayed home with one another. But in the city of Holland itself, one of the challenges with Holland with declining enrollment, certainly there was the issue of school choice. There's the issue of affordable housing and young families being able to live in the district. And there was the also issue of a nearly 30% decline in birth rate across the city. The city of Holland is an aging community. Now, there are pockets within the city where neighborhoods are being revitalized, and individuals who grew up in Holland are returning back now as younger professionals and perhaps starting a family. So there's beginning to have some of that change. But again, as Donna raised, there's this whole affordable housing issue in the city. And so we have all of these things that are just bumping up against one another.
Yeah.
The trends are declining birth rates. The trend is the collective minority is becoming the majority across our state, across our country. That's why it's so critically important that we have windows and mirrors, that we're preparing students to not only interact with one another as they live, work, and play in their local schools and community, but as they live, work, and play in the larger context. So you're going to see many more individuals as our Hispanic population specifically here in our area continues to grow and expand, our African American population. And then we are beginning to see, we had refugees coming in from Afghanistan. I think it's still unknown what it's going to look like with what the situation in Ukraine is going to present itself as individuals seek asylum. And as we know here in West Michigan, we have many organizations that work with families to help foster and create that, whether it's formal adoption agencies, and certainly given the presence of our faith-based community here, there's a lot of work in that arena. So I anticipate here in our community, we'll see an increase as well.
Great.
And with that comes an increase in second language learners and the supports needed for that population, right?
Yeah,
and how do you
exactly.
provide transitional housing during that period of time? I think we're starting to see a rise in homelessness as well as the costs now. I was watching a 2020 special just last week. The country is short 4 million housing units in our country, 4 million today. And what's happening is as homes become available and for sale, they're being bought by large corporations because they recognize the money that can be made now on rent. And so the opportunity for a family now to buy a home in Holland is going to be further exacerbated because before the house even hits the market, these larger corporations and countries are large corporations across the country are buying homes, and you're going to see rent prices escalate even further. So it might cost you $2,000 a month to rent a house when it may have been $1,500 with your escrow to buy it.
Exactly.
So,
Well,
lots
and
of challenges.
I just got to make a quick comment. One of the first things I learned as a young professional, social worker, counselor in my field, same I believe is true for teachers, that you can't help someone or teach someone if they're hungry, if they don't know where they're going to sleep tonight, if they are cold or don't have what they need in terms of basic survival. So those needs have to be met first if we expect to make any progress.
Absolutely. And that's true for our teaching staff. We need to feed our teachers. We really, really do. We need to feed the whole entire education system. And they were not fed under the last administration at all. They were villainized, demoralized, criticized, and actually made fun of.
Yeah.
And so we're going to take a lot of time to heal from what happened there. I'm just looking at the time.
Keep going, I'm done.
We have a few things to get through yet, but this has been rich conversation. I want to transition a little bit as we can talk about some solutions. I've talked about many of these contributing factors that are here on the slide. There's the DeVos plan that I've mentioned there, the school choice petition, let Michigan kids learn. Dangerous, 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 dangerous. I've already mentioned that before. We've talked about reductions in pay over time for our teachers. Some things that have impacted this is mounting mandates, more legislation around read by grade 3. We've got these polarized structures, the restructuring of the pension system, false narratives that are just being shared about our education system in general, and just real lack of empowerment. Great teachers who can do incredible things in the classroom with all of these new mandates feel as though the opportunity to be as creative and working together collaboratively and collegially, they just don't feel empowered to do that and the support to do that. And that's one of the main contributing factors that is actually causing this exodus. I mentioned before, it's not confined to teachers. From August through February of that same time period I mentioned before, there was a 33% increase in retirements for superintendents, principals, counselors, paraprofessionals, and other school support staff. And so when we have the top leadership leaving, the teachers leaving, that then is creating a stress across the entire system. when you have solid, good superintendents and principals and counselors who are providing those supports to our teachers, when you have those paraprofessionals who are coming in the classroom to assist with some of those most challenged learners, when they're retiring, that's creating further stress on the system, but it's also creating further stress on our teachers. Dan Dominic, who's the executive director of school superintendents, he said there's no doubt that we're seeing the greatest exodus of leadership at the district level that we have seen in this country. The greatest exodus now that we have ever seen in this country. The numbers that are just walking out the door and retiring early, because the superintendent now has more and more superintendents don't have a buffer now with the community. The buffer used to be the school board. And now many school boards are split, 4-3, 3-4. It's time to talk about whether or not we're going to wear masks or not. And the board is split 4-3 one night and 3-4 the other night. And so who's the face of the community? It's the superintendent who's trying to address all these things. I have superintendents in the state who actually have bodyguards in some of our larger districts because of the threats. We've had threats made against board members, physical threats, where it resulted in charges of terrorism. Folks, we need to get ourselves back into a state of where we can work together and talk together and problem solve together and not be so polarized. 96 vacancies just this past school year in the superintendent level. That's up a third from what it was the year prior. 11 ISDs. If we look here in Ottawa County, Hamilton, Holland, Jenison, Holland Christian is relatively new. West Ottawa, Zeeland, Grand Haven. 7 out of the 11. Substantial. So when you talk about school leadership, that makes a difference also.
Dr. Davis,
Yes, Carol.
I've been waiting to compliment you on the fact that you're giving us all this very important and urgent information. It needs to get out to the community at large, not just to people with who are retired teachers and school administrators or retired school board members. First of all, would you be willing to give your presentation and all the additional information to a HASP monthly meeting? Their regular monthly meeting. I think what you have to tell us, and it's more alarming than I expected it to be. So what you need to tell us certainly could start with educating the members of HASP at a monthly meeting. And then more people should be putting letters into the newspapers like the Holland Sentinel or even big articles so that people understand that the future of our country depends on a good educating everybody adequately. Otherwise, our crime will go up. We just put more people in prison. We have far more people unqualified to get decent jobs. So my first question is, I guess, would you be willing to give that presentation at a monthly meeting?
Well, the answer is absolutely. I would be willing to do so.
Okay. Also, I want to mention this. I've known about Betsy DeVos for many years, and she's no friend of public education. I think she's one of the greatest single threats to the future of our public schools. So I wonder if you want to comment on that. How I didn't know about the petition, the new petition that is being circulated. We can certainly be working on that. So that, what exactly was she she's in favor of giving vouchers as usual. She's been doing that for many, many years. I wrote, it's not, maybe five years ago, I wrote a letter to the Holland Sentinel, which did not spoke against Betsy DeVos's agenda. I hope more people will do that. If you're retired and don't, then you don't have to worry about getting fired because of what you're saying in public. I don't know if you have comments about that.
Yeah, I'll just simply share that I think there's a false narrative about what is or isn't happening in our schools. And sometimes we take an example and we overgeneralize it and make it true across all sectors. And some examples would be collective bargaining. Collective bargaining is in place to help preserve some democracy in our country. It's there to help preserve wages and benefits and working conditions for individuals. It's a process that brings management and labor together to engage in conversation. And it can be difficult at times, especially during times of scarcity. But there's many successful models that can be put in play to have good conversations around that. I think there's this bad taste in the mouth that still exists when times were very challenging, where it didn't go so well, that, that labor and management are at complete odds with one another. That may be true in some places, but it's not true in all places. And we can certainly learn from those that have done that well. That's part of this whole voucher choice thing, because kids get hurt during those times. I think the choice piece we have choice in Michigan. My gosh, we've had more choice in Michigan than there's ever before. We want to have more choice. I think there's a disconnect with the reality of choice. Those that choose to go oftentimes are your more affluent families who have access to transportation. The other choice that's happening, and I'm just going to name it for what it is white flight. It's our white dominant majority families leaving communities that are beginning to change economically and or ethnically, because we have a polarized thing around a social construct in our country. It is called race. It's a social construct. This doesn't exist anywhere else. But I think if we look at what happened in South Africa during apartheid, is that what's happening here? I think when we talk about the choice system, to be able to say we're going to give these vouchers to kids to go to the private sector, I'm not sure the private sector is equipped to educate the children that this voucher system is planned about, because their costs will escalate. And I dare say that some of the individuals within some of those sectors are there because they left the sector where those children were, right? So I think it's built upon a strong false narrative, not based upon what reality is. I believe in all of my years that family engagement is so critically important, and families should get to decide where they want to send their children. But we need to be investing our time, energy, and resources and making sure that our traditional neighborhood public schools are the best places they could ever be, so that people don't want to have to choice out, and that we equip them with the resources necessary to do that. This voucher system, this tax benefit system that she is behind and has been orchestrating now for a number of years in different ways and has failed, and she's persistent about it because she believes in that choice piece and some of the false narratives that it will destroy public education, because it will funnel fewer and fewer resources, $500 million in the first year, that will give tax credits back to those that contribute to that. We can't privatize education in our country. We can't privatize education in our state. It will run to the crux of every educator who's on this screen about why we went into education. And that was to serve every child, regardless of who they were or their background or where they're from. So we could have a whole big conversation around that. Just don't sign the petition and learn more about it so that you can speak intelligently about it to individuals, because the way it's being phrased, who wouldn't want to give our most vulnerable students additional resources and money because they've experienced such negativity during the COVID pandemic, to have resources to go to wherever they want? It's a good story. But people that
Agreed.
aren't part of the sector don't understand the ripple effect, and it may not actually be a choice for them.
I want to mention something about those private schools. I heard from a retired superintendent about this, and I want to see what you think, if it's true, that some of these private schools started by the DeVos family are run by corporations. They are for profit. So the corporations make some money from it. They appoint their own school board, which does not have to take any, there's no accountability to the general public. The general public is paying the taxes that support the school, but they have no say in what happens. I just think it's such an autocratic threat to public education. Now, what I said, is that true?
And
Or to what extent?
Yep, it depends upon the authorizing charter, but it is true in some cases, and it's not fully true in others. But there are elements of everything that you are said that are true. There are many for-profit charters. Yes, there are boards that are appointed. Charter schools are supposed to be following the same academic standards as what the traditional K-12 schools are, because they're funded the same way. There are some limitations, but yes, much of what you said is very true in some circumstances. It just depends upon the chartering authority.
Of course, they can teach whatever they want to, whether it's false narratives, that the world was created, the earth was created in 7 days, whatever they think it, represents their religious ideas or any false information that they have picked up from the anti-public school people.
Yeah, the difference between public and parochial, for sure. Yeah. I'm just
Thank you, Brian. I would encourage you you must have other slides that you need to get to.
Yeah, I'm going to get through a few. Please know that this slide deck, if you want a copy of it, I provided it to Kim, so you can delve into this into some more detail. I'm not going to go into all of these details now because we've talked to some of them. Here's some more, and I've had it on the screen for a little bit that people could read if they wanted to, in terms of another survey that looked at why teachers are leaving the profession, burnout being one of them. Just wanted to share, we talked about this before, the trend of teacher preparation programs and how this is how individual programs are depleting over time. This is a national piece. Again, it's just a trend line. We talked a little bit about the decline in our teacher preparation programs, especially for individuals that would be more demographically reflective of our community. And so to counter this overlapping crisis of the pandemic, the stressful work environments, institutionalized inequities, a shrinking pool of applicants is going to require us to do some very different things, because we have now the Great Resignation. In the last 2 years, the impact and stressors of COVID, on top of all those other contributing factors, is exacerbated this decline out. And it's actually being called, and we will know this now in history moving forward. Our kids will understand and learn about this someday, the Great Resignation and the impact in our schools. Just to share more, we have that shrinking applicant pool in terms of who's actually being there. The millennials, their student debt burden. That's why you saw that advertisement from Jackson Public Schools I mentioned earlier. 75% of school districts are struggling to find enough substitutes to cover their teacher absences this last school year. That hasn't changed, even despite some of the pieces that have been put into place. 60% of teachers who said they enjoyed their jobs less in 2020 than in 2019. A lot of that related to the COVID piece. 1/3, the proportion of teachers who say they're likely to leave the profession, compared to 8% before the pandemic. So just all of these contributing factors. You can see some more here in terms of some pre-existing inequities, especially for our teachers of color, our staff of color. The percentage of Black staff who agree that their districts treat staff with respect compared to nearly 80% of Asian, Hispanic, and white staff. So even within our profession, we have some tensions that we really need to address in terms of not only culture and climate, but also pay. So what can we do? We need to understand what these workplace conditions are. We need to understand and better talk and listen to our teaching staff about their state of mental health in working through a lot of these things. And how do we monitor their staff well-being and provide supports? And how do we work to build a supportive staff culture? How do we allow retired teachers who are receiving a pension to come back into the classroom and work and not have to sacrifice their pension at the same time, or limit the amount that you can make by going back? I mean, that's just crazy. We're not willing to budge on that issue. How do we go look at grow your own programs? How do we create these alternative pathways to certification? That's what I do in my current job. I have an alternative pathway that I'm credentialed through the Michigan Department of Ed to help skill up and train to be building principals, central office administrators, and get them their certificates without having to go through a formalized master's degree program over a 3-year period of time. I'm not going to go through all of these if you ask Kim for a copy of the slide deck, but what this is nice about this document is from the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching on the left, and it's from the National Education Association representing labor groups on the right, talking about and breaking these contributing factors down based upon physical features, political and cultural features, psychological features, being able to look at curricular support, support for new teachers, professional development, all the things on the right-hand side. If you look at that, what's needed, it's not pay and compensation. I don't want to dismiss, those are critically important factors, but we're talking about, do I have the same teaching assignment from one year to the next, or am I teaching 3rd grade this year, then 2nd grade, then 8th grade, then 4th grade? How do I create collaborative opportunities and time during the day for teachers to come together in professional practice and learning and work together? How do we provide that curricular support so they're really engaged in developing and designing that curriculum just versus a mandate coming down? Do they have the proper resources to teach, or are they having to spend $2,500 a year out of their own pocket for the necessary materials in their classroom? How do we make sure that they're working in facilities that are upgraded and quality air and the technology that's needed and just bright and inspiring places? All these pieces are what teachers are saying in terms of working conditions that they would like to see happen and change. That's from the NEA. So you can take some time to look at that. This was an idea that was kind of brought up a little bit earlier, but Launch Michigan talked about being able to create scholarships. This is one of their ideas per year at a 4-year Michigan university to help pay for the credits that teachers need to have to gain their teaching degree. How do we pay them $37.50 per semester in scholarship for student teaching? How do we target specifically some diverse candidates into the pool and additional incentives? Here's a challenge. There's a price tag. For every 1,000 teachers to do that, it's $35 million. For every 4,000 teachers to do that, it's $140 million. That's why Launch Michigan is trying to bring together the business sector and philanthropy to be able to say, how do we pay for this? It might be a tax incentive kickback, or do we pay more? Or how do we tax businesses differently? But how can philanthropy come together? There's money in this state. There's a lot of money in this state to be able to do some of these things. There's a lot of information here I won't go through given our time that we have, but additional state level strategies that if you want to learn more about what's being done to address a teacher shortage, everything from hiring practices to providing mentoring and induction programs so that we don't have that 44% leaving the profession in 5 years. How are we looking at really improving the teachers' working conditions overall? And again, the last piece is being able to look at teacher compensation, because that is a piece. They need to be able to sustain and support a middle class lifestyle, right? And right now, in many cases, they're not able to do so. There's a lot of strategies that are going on for recruiting teachers. I mentioned before some of those grow your own programs and what does that look like? Similar strategies for substitute teachers and how do we engage in that, and providing some additional financial incentives. And how do we identify these individuals who have a great knack of working with kids and children and being able to create that pipeline for them too, so that they can become teachers, and providing ways to do that. District mentorship programs and additional pieces to improve the climate, all pieces there you can take a look at as well if you would like. And then there's just some really good practices around school management practices, instructional leadership practices, and decision-making. And I'll just spend some time just quickly here at the bottom. Teachers want to feel empowered. They want to feel part of the process. They want to be heard. They want to have their input not only listened to and valued, but actually see some action come from the ideas that they have. They're the boots on the ground. They're the ones that are in the classrooms each and every day. When I was a superintendent, I tried to get into a building every Wednesday morning and spend 2 or 3 hours visiting classrooms and talking to the teachers and talking to kids. But that was just a half a day a week. I wish I could have had more within my schedule to do that. We need to be able to find better ways to listen to their ideas, empower them to participate in decision-making, and provide opportunities for them to assume leadership roles that can help to influence curriculum and policy, to really work together to address some of the challenging student behaviors that are surfacing as a result of some of the social emotional stress and trauma that kids have faced. And we need to do a much better job of supporting teacher autonomy within our classrooms. If we've hired the best candidates, we provide mentoring and coaching support for them. We give them a solid curriculum and resources to teach with. Let's let them do their job. Let's let them do what they've been hired to do. And I really felt that with the teachers that we had in Holland and the surrounding area, but I can only speak to that directly. But my hands were handcuffed and tied at times based upon some of the mandates that we had. It's unprecedented as we close out. There's $122 billion, $122 billion that have gone into our schools from the Emergency Relief Fund for K-12 education. And only 15 to 40% of that, depending upon what state you're in, has actually been spent. Michigan just finally appropriated our money because it got hung up in the politics of mask wearing or not, and what the governor did or not. And it became so polarized. But just some examples of how some states are using their funds to be able to address a lot of the things that we talked about. Missouri, $29.2 million for teacher training and recruitment and retention grants, just to be able to address the teacher crisis as a whole. Oklahoma, looking at how they're impacting their salaries and increasing school counselors and licensed mental health professionals, etc. The challenge with this is, how do you best spend the biggest investment in public education in our country to have the greatest impact, but also to be able to sustain and maintain over time? Because we aren't going to be able to do $122 billion again in the very near future, right? So this is a critical time for school leaders, the community as a whole, philanthropy, business, private and nonprofit sectors, labor groups and management groups to come together in that great bargain to be able to say in Launch Michigan, how can we effectively utilize these resources together, and how are we going to sustain this over time? Because our kids' future, the generation of kids that we have today, is at stake. These are the game changers that teachers talk about. We need to have administrative leadership that supports us in our work, collegiality, to be able to have that time to work together during the day, not at the end of the day for 3 hours when I'm tired and exhausted and can't contribute well. I need to have professional development that is relevant to me and part of a long-term plan and not something different every single month. I need to have a community that supports me and supports me well in my profession, and recognizing that school culture affects everything. This is what our teachers are saying time and time and time again. Yes, additional money and resources and benefits and pension, those are all things too that are important. But in the absence of all these things, money doesn't matter. I need to have these things in place too. So I would just like to say, as it's 10:58 by my clock, thank you so much for the opportunity to share with you today. Again, the slide deck Kim has available. I don't know the process of communicating there.
I can email it to everyone who's registered for the class. No problem.
Oh, thank you.
And I'm happy to, Carol, come back and speak to whatever format or group, because this is a crisis. It's a crisis that's been in the making for a long time, but it certainly has been exacerbated with this global pandemic that we've faced. And it's great to see some names and some faces of individuals I've gotten the pleasure to work with across the community as a whole. Kim, great to spend time with you and to hear what your daughter's doing, proud graduate of Holland Public, and that she's going to be a teacher.
Yeah.
Who wants to be a teacher. So excited about that. And Jan, it was a pleasure as always to spend some time with you. I don't know if you have any closing thoughts, Jan, to wrap this up, but I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, thank you.
Let me quick give Jan, before you close this up,
Yes.
Claudia Barry had a quick question. I'm going to let her ask that a minute, and then if you could wrap up, that would be great. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Kim, and Brian, thank you for a wonderful presentation. I just want all of you to know that are on here that I do chair the monthly program committee, and I will take your thoughts back and several of the topics that Brian spoke to that we could elaborate on for the entire membership to hear. I want to just make you all aware that the petition that is being circulated by Betsy DeVos can become a law, whether the governor vetoes it or not. It is
Correct.
a citizens initiated petition. So if they reach the required 359,000 and some odd signatures, and they are all verified, and the legislature passes it and our governor vetoes it, it does not matter, because this is in the Michigan Constitution that citizens can bring this forward. So I just want you to be aware it is imperative that if you do not believe in what it says, to encourage and explain it well, do not sign it, because 359,000 signatures is not a lot to speak for the entire state of Michigan. And it is one of 3 petitions out there. I won't cover the other 2, but we need to find a way just to create this awareness. So just want to make you aware that even if our governor vetoes it, it can become a reality.
Thank you, Claudia.
Yeah, thank you, Claudia. And it probably would behoove us as HASP to look at the other 3, to talk about the 3, and maybe that's something League of Women can do. So thank you so much for your participation. As always, Brian always prepares much more information than he can get to, but it's a vital topic. And thank you for your participation and your questions and your encouragement for the monthly meeting, because the more the HASP members can understand the crisis and communicate, it's another venue for movement. So thank you very much, Brian. We appreciate you. And
Awesome. Great to see you. Thanks so
Yes,
much.
my
Thank you.
pleasure.
Have a great
Love on
Friday,
a teacher.
everyone. And I
If
will
I can ask
email
you to
the
do anything
PowerPoint
today.
presentation to everyone registered.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Love on
a
a teacher.
Love on
Yeah.
a teacher today. Love on
Yeah,
a teacher.
love. Yes, love on a teacher today.
Thanks, Brian.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Mhm.